basically knows this, the way God works in human history is largely mysterious. We don't always know how or why he does things the way that he does, but he does take every event that happens, all the good, all the bad, all the everything, and he works out his purposes in all things. But in spite of that, or in addition to that, God also places each one of us in a unique, specific time and place in history and gives you and I the opportunity to participate in whatever he's going to do in the future. He gives us the chance and the choice. Are you going to go along with what I'm doing? It makes me think of a passage in Scripture in the book of Esther. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. But what I want to look at is a quick little passage in Esther chapter 4. And the basics of what happens in Esther is that the Jewish people were in exile in the Persian Empire. So the people of Israel, of Judah specifically, had been taken from their homeland, first to Babylon, and then the Babylonians got taken over by the Persians. And so in this period, the Jews are in this land, in the Persian Empire. And this strange sequence of events happens in the book. At the beginning, there was a woman married to the emperor in Persia, to the king, and her name was Vashti. And she did something that the king did not like. He was at a dinner party with his friends, and he summoned her and said, I want my wife to come in here because she's so beautiful and I want you all to see her. And the wife said, I'm not going to get summoned by you. I'm not going to show up. And so because of that, I feel sympathetic toward Queen Vashti, but she was removed from her position for that reason. She could not be queen anymore. And so they do this big search to find the next queen of Persia. It's kind of like a precursor to reality shows before they happen. You're like, who's going to be the next queen? And Vashti was known to be a beautiful woman. It's the reason that the king wanted to parade her in front of all the nobles. But the woman who ends up being chosen as the next queen is this Jewish girl named Esther. And she was chosen largely because of her beauty. Anyway, I'm skipping most of what happens in the book to get to the part we need to talk about. Her uncle, Esther's uncle, Mordecai, finds out about a plot to kill all of the Jews in Persia. So there's a plot from some of the political officials that want to kill all the Jews. I don't know if you've ever heard this story before. It's only repeated itself dozens of times in human history. But they wanted to wipe out the Jews, and the uncle finds out about it. And so he sends a message to Esther and said, you need to go to the king and speak to him. If you don't, who knows what's going to happen to our people? And her response was this. She said, it's the law of the land that I cannot go to the king unless I'm summoned by him. If I appear before him not being summoned, I will be killed. It's the law. And you saw what happened to the previous queen. She didn't do what the king had said, and she was removed from her position. And Mordecai gives her this incredible response, telling her what she needs to do and why. And this is in chapter 4. It's 2 verses. It's verses 13 and 14. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? Mordecai says to her, deliverance is going to come to the Jews one way or the other. Trivia, little thing you might like to hear. Esther's the only book of the Bible that does not outright say God's name at any point. But you notice here that what Mordecai says is that the Jews are going to be saved one way or the other. The reason he believes that is because they are God's people. So it's implied God is going to rescue his people one way or the other. And if you don't do it, then you and your father's house are probably going to be killed. But he responds with this wonderful idea, and he says, and who knows, maybe God has put you in this position for just such a moment as right now, for such a time as this. That theological idea that God has placed her at that moment, at that time, to give her the opportunity to be a part of what he wants to do in the world is something that I think you and I need to grasp. That God has placed you and I specifically in this moment, in this time, in this place, to give us an opportunity to do whatever it is that he wants us to do. We have a chance to be a part of what God is going to do in the world. And so for Esther, that means that she needed to know that she came from the people of Israel, that it mattered that they be preserved as a people because God had plans for them, and that her, being the beautiful woman that she was in that royal position, had a unique job to say yes to the Lord in obedience. I'll spoil the story. She does go to the king, and the Jews are all saved as a result. Still read it anyway, but that's what happens in that story. But I've been chewing on this idea that Mordecai brings to Esther as we come into this week with July 4th approaching for us. If it's true that you and I have a responsibility in the same way as Esther to know why we are where we are in order to know where we need to go in the future, I think that means that we should maybe take a look back and ask, why are we here where we are? What has happened in the past that's led us up to where we are right now? You guys are about to learn something about me. I love history. I love history so much. I read it all the time. I probably am going to pepper you with all sorts of illustrations and stuff in the future using history. And so tonight, I want to do that. I want to take a snapshot of a few moments in the history of our continent and in our country about what God has done in the past that might give us a clue about something that God might want us to do now in the present. So I can't exhaustively cover all of United States history in one session, so we're not going to do that. But I do want to talk about a couple of moments and then reflect on maybe what those moments mean. So the first thing I want to talk about is this. You may have had to read about this in school, but one of the first groups of settlers that ended up coming to the United States, and this was in about 1620, were a group that came on this one ship called the Mayflower. I have a picture of it here. You had to read about them in school because these are the people that became the Pilgrims a little bit later. And basically who these people were is that there were 102 people on that ship, so very few people, but they were a group of Christian separatists from England. They didn't want to worship the way that they had to in England, so that they didn't want to conform to the Church of England. They wanted to worship it in this specific way. And so they got on a ship and sailed for months on an incredibly perilous journey across the world, not knowing where they were going. And then they arrived at where they were going to establish this new colony. And this became New England. It was the first of the perpetual colonies that were, it continued into the future. So there have been a few settlers that came before, and we don't know what happened to them. They died. But New England was this first long-term colony. And the people on this ship, though only 102 of them, had a really interesting idea of why they were going. They believed that they were making a covenant with God, them and God, that if they would follow what God wanted them to do, that God would bless them. And if they didn't, then he wouldn't. And right before they landed, one of their pastors on the ship, a guy named John Winthrop, addressed the group. This is going to be a fairly long quote here, so you'll have to stay with me as I read it. But this is what he said to the people on the ship. He said, "Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into covenant with him for this work. We have taken out a commission. The Lord hath given us leave to draw our own articles." He means our own articles of government and of worship. "Now if the Lord shall please to hear us and bring us in peace to the place we desire, then hath he ratified this covenant and sealed our commission, and will expect a strict performance of the articles contained in it." So they said, if God blesses the governing articles that we're giving here, he expects us to follow them. We'll keep reading. "But if we shall neglect the observation of these articles, which are the ends we have propounded, and dissembling with our God, shall fail to embrace this present world and prosecute our carnal intentions." I love the way they talked in this time period. "Seeking great things for ourselves and our descendants, our posterity, the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us and be revenged of such a people and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant." So they say, we've made this covenant with God. If we and our descendants break it, we pursue our carnal intentions, the ways of the world, then we're likely going to experience God's wrath. Now, the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah. This is the prophet Micah. "To do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man." And this is the most famous part of this little address here. He says, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." This is a really fascinating sermon. Keep in mind, this is 102 people on a dingy, dirty ship. I can't even believe that they made it into the New World at all. And they had the audacity to believe that they were making a covenant with God, that if they would follow it, that God could change the world through them. And if they didn't, they would, he says it this way, that we would just become a byword in human history. Now, don't know if I would have the boldness to claim that we were making such a covenant with God and that success would mean that God had blessed us. But what's undeniably true is that worldview set the precedent for what would be the original of the colonies on the eastern part of our country. That is the worldview that the original settlers had. And they believed we have an opportunity to change the entire course of human history. Now, that little group of people, after the first winter in New England, there were only 50 of them left. 50 people. And so 50, we have many multiples of that number of people in this room right now. And those 50 people believed that they would change the future of humanity. And the craziest part about it is they did. They did actually alter the entire future of humanity. And they believed that they needed to walk with the Lord closely going into the future. So after that group goes in there, you've probably read chunks of this in school, the colonies did grow, and more colonies came in as a result. New England was not the only one, but the New World, against all odds, really succeeded. The cities grew eventually. That became Massachusetts and Boston and all these other cities that propped up. But after about 80 years, around the time of 1700, you had these cities that had grown up in an economy that had grown quite a bit, and the Lord had clearly blessed those original colonies. But the religious leaders started to believe that the people had lost their spiritual edge. They had lost that commitment that the original people on the Mayflower had to walk closely with the Lord. And so many of the preachers started giving these kind of sermons called a Jeremiad. Basically, it was hearkening back to the prophets where they would get up and say, we are sinning over and over again and God's going to destroy us. Wake up, he's going to destroy us. And so they would give these sermons, and you can look them up. They're kind of hilarious to read. And when they talk about the kind of sins they were committing, they seem very tame compared to what we talk about now. But anyway, they started to believe we need to turn around and repent, or God is probably going to destroy us. I was reading from one of these pastors, and essentially he said this. He said, we've tried every normal human means to change the morality of our nation, of our cities, of our colonies, and nothing's worked. The only thing that could work is God giving an outpouring of his Spirit in an incredible way. And the unlikely and crazy thing that happened is that exact thing happened. God did give an incredible outpouring of his Spirit in an event that historians call the First Great Awakening. So the majority of this happened in the years 1740 to 1743. But basically, to explain what happened, the entirety of the 13 colonies caught fire with religious fervor, meaning people were feeling convicted of their sin. They were wanting to change their ways. They wanted to become close to the Lord. And the way that this was shown really dramatically, there was an evangelist named George Whitefield. He came from Britain, and the way they explained him is he was kind of a theatrical preacher. He would talk in these incredible ways. He was not boring and stale, but many thousands of people would come out to hear George Whitefield speak. And so the estimates were, there'd often be 3,000-4,000 people come out when this guy's talking with no microphones. One of the people that actually did this, Benjamin Franklin at the time, heard about all this hubbub in Massachusetts and in Boston. And so he went and he listened to George Whitefield, and he walked off the area, and he said because this guy had such an incredible voice, he could speak to where as many as 8,000 to 10,000 people could hear him speak. Really wild. And the reality was everywhere that Whitefield went, these giant crowds would come out and have this experience of wanting to turn their life over to the Lord. I read about one of these stories this week. There was a guy in Kentucky. He was in his fields working. So he had his farm equipment, and someone rode by on their horse and said that George Whitefield was about to speak at a nearby town. He drops his equipment right there in the field, gets on a horse, rides 12 miles to the closest town, and when he gets there, he said there was a cloud of smoke as though there had been a battle in the area. And what it was these thousands of people on their horses trying to get ready to listen to Whitefield speak. And he said he heard Whitefield speak, and he was pierced to the heart, and he knew that his righteousness was not enough in front of the Lord. And the reason I say all this is just to say something legitimately happened in this stretch in the 1730s and 40s where God really had this outpouring of people wanting to pay attention to him and turn their lives over to him. And this didn't just happen in big rallies with George Whitefield. It happened in individual churches. And one of the places that we learn about this is from a pastor at the time named Jonathan Edwards. You might have had to read Jonathan Edwards in school. He has a famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he says that your soul is perilously like a spider dangling over a tiny web over the fires of hell. It's the story that many of us had to read in school. But Edwards was actually not a fiery preacher. He was kind of boring. He would stand in front of his notes and he would just read them. But Edwards in his church, right before 1740s, this is in the mid 1730s, they had this awakening in their own little church community. So he tells us in this little book he writes that there were about 200 families that lived in his town. But God got a hold of their community. And here are some of the things he said happened in this time of awakening and revival. He said, there was scarcely a single person in the town, either old or young, that was left unconcerned about the great things of the eternal world. Those that were wont to be the vainest and loosest, and those that had been the most disposed to think and speak slightly of vital and experimental religion, were now generally subject to great awakenings. And the work of conversion was carried on in a most astonishing manner and increased more and more. Souls did, as it were, come by flocks to Jesus Christ. So Edwards said this little town where they have only 200 people, all of a sudden, all everyone wanted to talk about were the things of God. You had these people that were concerned about the state of their soul, and people were over and over again coming to the Lord. He says this in 1737, the work of God's Spirit seemed to be at its greatest height in the town in the former part of spring, in March and April, at which time God's work in the conversion of souls was carried out amongst us in so wonderful a manner. He ends up saying they were at least 3 or 4 people a day coming to faith in Christ over a period of about 6 weeks. Now, that doesn't sound like that many people, but in a town of only 200 families, that's like everyone. They were having this incredible outpouring of people turning to the Lord. He said there was as much done in a day or two as at ordinary times with all endeavors that men can use, and with such a blessing as we commonly have is done in a year. So he said God was pouring out his Spirit and having people turn to him in a way that usually we'd only see this happening in a year or 2 years, and it was happening in a day or a week. So it was this outpouring of God's Spirit in this time, and that's why it ends up being called the First Great Awakening. That set the stage in the colonies for what was coming afterward. This revolutionary idea that God had some specific plans for this group of people, it permeated the entirety of the colonies. They were ready for something different. One of the people, the contemporaries of George Whitefield, said this about it. They were so anticipatory about what God was going to do. He said this, behold, some great things seem to be upon the anvil, some big prophecy at the birth. God give it strength to bring it forth. So the awakening, the Great Awakening, it brought about religious, spiritual, and then even political expectations about what might happen next. Now, if you look at the time frame we're talking about, this is 1740 that the Great Awakening happened, and it changed the people in the colonies and made them ready for the next major event that was going to happen in the colonies, which was the American Revolution, about 20 years later. I'm of the opinion that the Great Awakening really was the seedbed that made people ready for something revolutionary and different. And when the time for the American Revolution came, some of the founders, like Thomas Jefferson, who himself was, I would say, not a believer. He had a different worldview, but he became allied with a lot of these evangelicals, the Baptists and Methodists and others, in their pursuit to do away with the oversight of England. And by the time that the Declaration of Independence was written, this is one of the first lines of it. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the beginning of the Declaration, it says that the reason we have rights and liberties that are worth pursuing is because they come from God. They come from our Creator. And so Jefferson was writing that in the Declaration, but the reason that the people of the colonies believed it is because God had just poured out his Spirit on them in this Great Awakening. And so God used this moment to alter the future of what was going to happen in the colonies. Now, I'm not going to pretend that everything was hunky-dory in the colonies at this point. The belief that Jefferson had that all men were created equal was largely at odds with what was happening in the colonies. So even when the United States became a nation, under the belief that all men are created equal and having these rights, there also was the cognitive dissonance that the founders and the people of the nation were not treating every person as though they had these inalienable rights. They were coexisting with this system of slavery. So from the beginning of our nation, God had poured out his Spirit. It led them to these conclusions, but it was still extremely messy. The nation had not lived up to what God had called it to be. And I would say that at the founding of the nation, because of the beliefs that we had from the beginning, the nation was already on the path toward the Civil War right from the beginning. That question of slavery had to be dealt with if we really believe that all men are created equal because we're made in God's image. So, after a little while, after the American Revolution, a second period of awakening came about. And creatively, historians call this the Second Great Awakening. It's the same name as the first. But there was this period from about 1800 to 1830 where something very similar happened. That there were these giant revivals where people from all over would show up and hear people preaching the gospel, and they would have these dramatic experiences of feeling God's Spirit poured out on them. Some of the interesting ones I read about this, keep in mind, there were not many large towns at this point, especially in the South. But there were accounts of groups of up to 10,000, 20,000 people showing up for these camp meetings where all they were doing was that they were taking the Lord's Supper and they were worshiping, and that people would be convicted of their sins and they would give their lives over to the Lord. I have a passage of one person talking about one of these camp meetings, a guy named Barton Stone. He said this: "The roads were literally crowded with wagons, carriages, horsemen, and footmen moving to the solemn camp. The sight was affecting. It was judged by military men on the ground that there were between 20 and 30,000 collected. 4 or 5 preachers were frequently speaking at the same time in different parts of the encampment without confusion." So you'd have these people, 20,000 people show up, and the most famous of these, I believe it was called Barton Ridge, was the name of the encampment. And the thing that was interesting about this is that there were estimated to be 10 to 20,000 people there in a town that only had about 1,000 people that lived there. So people came from all over to hear these things. And in this period, some of the church denominations, specifically Baptist and Methodist, exploded, and they moved westward. And people had these experiences where they were giving their lives over to the Lord and having these really ecstatic experiences of experiencing God's presence. I will say, like I said before, it was not all hunky-dory. There were some excesses in this period. This is where the Mormons came from in the Second Great Awakening. There are plenty of stories that you read about where some of these awakenings got a little bit out of hand. But the thing that cannot be denied is that people were having experiences with God and then having their lives changed as a result. And after this, I told you the dates for this were about 1800 to 1830, 1835. Almost all of the most radical abolitionists in the North that wanted to get rid of slavery were evangelical Christians that had their lives affected in this Second Great Awakening. That God poured out his Spirit, it set the religious direction of the future of the country, and it really set the table again for the Civil War. So these two Great Awakenings are known to be historical facts, but in the 20th century, many people said, well, those were just phenomena that happened in those early periods where we didn't have radio and didn't have TV and people just wanted to be entertained. That's never going to happen again. Those kind of awakenings or revivals, they were just bored. They didn't have anything else to do. There's no way anything like that would happen again. But I think if anyone watched the last 100 years in the 1900s, there were revivals all over the place. And the most notable of those would be done by Billy Graham. Billy Graham went all over the world, but specifically in different parts of the United States. And what he did was very simple. He just got up and preached the gospel and gave people a chance to respond, and they did. The picture I have here was a picture of that's Times Square, where there were over 100,000 people there to listen to him. And the thing that I'm trying to impress upon you is that the history of our country, even before it was a country, was a history of these periodic revivals where God got people's attention one way or the other. It was never perfect. It was always messy, but it just seems to have happened over and over again. Billy Graham said this about revivals. Individually, revival can come only as a result of a vital, personal relationship with God. In society, revival can be felt only as individuals interpret their faith into the language of everyday life and live the faith they profess, not only in the houses of worship, but in the home, the office, the shop, and in the streets. Billy Graham was pretty straightforward, right down the middle, present the gospel, and he said revivals can happen in an individual person's life, but they can also happen in a society and in a culture when the church lives and acts the way that it should. When we live out our faith not just in the worship building, not just in the worship center, but everywhere. And here's the one thing that I want to leave you with tonight. I didn't mean to just give you a history lesson for the sake of giving you one. But I think what's pretty clear is that the history of where we are and where we come from is a messy history. It's never been perfect. There have always been abuses. There have always been excesses. There have always been times that we haven't lived up to the initial things that our founders said that we should do, that all men are created equal and made in God's image. But in spite of that, I don't think there's any doubt that God has periodically, for unknown reasons at different times, had these outpourings of his Spirit where people just, they change. There are these revivals where people who are dead in their faith come back alive in their faith. People who don't know Jesus come to faith in Jesus. We don't always know why it happens or when. But the question I have then is this. If that's where we are and where we've come from, that's the place that God has placed us, I want to ask you and I the same question that Mordecai asked to Esther. Maybe God has placed you and I in this country with the history that we have for just such a moment as right now. We know that God has done this before. He's poured out his Spirit and done incredible things in groups of people. Who's to say that he won't do the same thing again here in this place? And if that is true, if there's a chance that that can happen, who's to say that it can't start with us right here? God has placed you and I in the northern part of Houston for a reason. Do I know exactly what that reason is? No. That's something that we have to try and figure out together. We are here for a purpose. And I do believe the way that John Winthrop said in his address to the people in the Mayflower, if we do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with our God, prepare our hearts, put aside the idols that are in our life, maybe God can start one of these incredible revivals right here in this service, at this place, at this time on Saturday nights. I hope that you're as excited about that possibility as I am. But the place that thank you. The place that it has to start with is you and I individually having a revival in our life. So that means if you don't know the Lord, you have to come to know the Lord. If you do know the Lord, it means putting aside whatever idols have a hold of your heart. It means putting aside priorities that are getting in the way of God having your all in all in your life. And if we do that, I really do believe that God could do something incredible with our church, with our campus, with this service right here. It could start with us. And if that's as exciting to you as it is to me, I would ask that you pray together with me for God to do something among us.